us believes that race significantly impacts meritocratic progression within modern Britain. And as is right with every debate, we must allow proposers and opposers to express their view without opposition. So please avoid any attempt to heckle or disagree, to shout or to interrupt. It's also very helpful if we don't use over-the-top facial expressions. Contain yourself as long as you can. Each opponent or proponent knows they have to be tight on time, and so we're going to start off with the first speaker on the side of the proposition from Techway Chief of Staff and New Role.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to debate today. When you look at the institutions and the forces around us, I think you'll quickly see that these are often quite powerful, sometimes quite invisible, but very rarely have I found them to be entirely blind to race. And that's why today I want to explain how race and progression are intricately linked in modern Britain in the professional and sphere of education. My brilliant colleagues, Millie and Keanna, are going to talk about generational inequality and healthcare, and of course, sweep up whatever is left, the opposition's case. I want to make 3 points about your career, I suppose, in the workplace. The first is that the historical biases we're aware of are still entrenched in hiring and promotion. The lack of representation at the management or the senior leadership level is still endemic, even if it has gotten better. There is still a broad lack of cultural awareness and respect in many workplaces, unfortunately, in this country. And all that does is create an environment of profound disengagement for minorities. It creates an environment where there is an earnings gap, an environment where an ethnic minority feels themselves under much greater scrutiny for their work, even if it is just as good, sometimes I would say, often better. When schools were desegregated in America, researchers quickly found that white teachers, unsurprisingly, were much more likely to identify gifted talent who was also white. So keep that fact in mind when I ask you to put yourself in the position, as many of you are, as a young professional in a corporate environment as a racial minority. Asking yourself, is my manager the right person to champion me, to fight my corner, and to fly air cover when I make a mistake? Do I have the right mentors to recognize my potential and help me achieve that? These are the types of questions that would keep me awake at night, and I would suggest not in the same way if I was a member of a visible majority. Second, the Parker Review has done some good, but I am unfortunately a little bit skeptical as to whether it has truly created a paradigm shift in the way we think about progression.
If race impedes to the degree that you describe, why have the race-based policies of the 2000s not led to the significant improvements in mobility they ought to have?
Because the types of forces we're talking about here run so deep and go through centuries of entrenchment that a mere policy in a couple of decades, you can weigh that up. On a numerical level, it seems like we need much more effort in order to correct that, and I think we are in that direction. Unfortunately, lots of senior leaders with these backgrounds after appointments struggle to advocate for greater representation, and this speaks to the point that Josh made. Often they are the only racial minority having a seat at that table, and in some cases they are a double minority in that role. D&I specialist Pooja Satdev writes, and I quote, "If a minority person talks about experience, they can look like a troublemaker. People think they're using the race card. There's a lot of considerable personal, social, and material risk to speaking up." And this is also true of younger professionals. It's worse as well. The concept of a diversity burden refers to the additional work that they must do, for example, being on a diversity committee, for example, being there for the access day in order to create a more open environment, that is often not recognized when it comes to promotions or to salary increases. That is often getting in the way of the other things you need to do, your business as usual, or the development pathways that are so vital. The fact is, talent is still not seen or rewarded in the same way in this country. Third is self-censorship and code switching. Now, I'm not going to make a huge point of this because I think it was covered brilliantly earlier by the panelist speaker. But we often learn this from our parents or our peers. Do this, don't do that. And all to serve a goal of avoiding a particular stereotype. In this country, 7 of 10 young black professionals have reported feeling the pressure to change their hair and their appearance in order to appear specifically more professional.
Time's up.
5-minute speaker. A little bit longer? All right. And the fact remains is that they did not get there by totally ignoring race. It was about an awareness, a consciousness, and adapting to that situation that got them that success. no longer significant seems trivial. Finally, I want to talk about education, because an education system is so vital, yet so unequitable right now in a deep-seated institutional way. And it fails many racial minority students and teachers. 49% of young black people in this country think that it's racism that is the biggest obstacle to success in schools and success in life thereafter. And that's even before you consider the effects of intersectionality, what that means for groups of different gender or different class. 46% of schools in this country don't have a teacher, a single teacher from an ethnic minority background. But I'm pretty sure that many of those schools would have students from said backgrounds. So there is a massive leak, if I can use this metaphor, in the pipeline of meritocracy. Much earlier down the line, students are not getting the opportunities to learn and develop their talents, such that by the time a corporation or a university runs an access day or has a target, there are many with the innate potential to make it there in the first place who have simply missed the bus. Race may no longer be an impediment to progress, but I'm pretty sure that it's still a big part of the story of our lives.
And I should have said in the introduction that Tekwei Tan has a first-class degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of Oxford. Just positioning. Opposing the motion, Jacqueline Kwan. Jacqueline is a freelance journalist, graduated from the University of Manchester with a master's in physics.
Testing. All right, there we go. I'm not here to lie to you that racism doesn't exist. I think I can say that COVID perhaps wasn't the best time to be an Asian person in the UK. My burden here is not to tell you that racism doesn't exist. Their burden to win is to prove to you two things. Number one, that meritocracy even exists in the UK in the first place. And secondly, if it does exist, race significantly impacts it, significant relative to other potential socioeconomic barriers such as class, such as access to education. So I'm going to tell you a couple things. Number one, I'm going to tell you that meritocracy just fundamentally does not exist within this country. Number two, even if it did, race is not the biggest barrier to it. Number one, meritocracy does not exist. I'm going to say something quite spicy here. I think the speakers that you have seen so far, i.e. me and Tex, have not come here against the odds. I think Tex and I are here because we are benefactors of huge opportunity. And we have been able to succeed at tasks and succeed at a test that we have come across so far because of the arbitrary fact of the privileges that we have been born with in terms of education, the fact that we've been given every resource to excel. If merit is about human character, about one's inherent potential and their hard work and demonstrated skill, then the UK simply is not a meritocracy because it doesn't let the majority of its population even have a go at rolling the dice, and if they do, the majority of population are rolling loaded ones. Look, whether you are afforded the luxury of tutoring, extracurricular activities, good teachers, excellent teaching resources, and university admissions coaching in the first formative years of your life have been shown to be highly determinative of your future success. The reason why this argument is important because for the emotion to actually be meaningful whatsoever, meritocracy itself has to exist in the UK, and it fundamentally just does not. Second, I'm going to talk to you about, even if it did, race is just not the biggest barrier to it. The reason why inequality and poverty is seen as endemic to race is because race itself is, we see race itself as enough to create poverty. It is because I say that the inequality that we see today is because people have been deprived of resources, entrenched in their own original position. Historically, the legacy of slavery and colonialism have meant that those who are deprived of resources are racial minorities. That's why the question that we asked in text was so important. If race was truly a determinative thing that caused, for example, people to be discriminated against in terms of opportunity, then why haven't the interventions that we've made resulted in huge increases in mobility? It's because inequality right now is, the true inequality here being disguised is that of wealth. That is a determinative factor in people's success. The race is a confounding variable in that. they need to prove that there is something unique about race that's capable of creating the structural inequality that we see today. Unfortunately, most of their analysis has been predicated in these micro interactions, your white boss ignoring you for a promotion, your white colleague stealing your work. The state of inequality that we see today is far too large to be due to these micro interactions alone. We posit to you that there's something far more insidious going on that are far more meaningful to your quality of life. Before I go on? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, it's within time.
Okay. Thank you. I was the first person in my family to go to university, and to that extent, I had to justify the choice of degree as one of the things they hadn't heard of, because it wasn't law or medicine. I think that's a bit of a stretch to say that there isn't meritocracy simply because some of us have had some opportunities. I think this country is very much still aspiring to be a meritocracy.
Yeah, but your entire first speech was about how meritocracy is fundamentally broken, how one is dependent on a bunch of resources that you were born with rather than ones that you have earned throughout your life. So if anything, the first speaker has his own points predicated on the very fact that meritocracy just does not exist. Surely, yeah, sure, that you can work hard and do well in your A-levels, but that is just fundamentally pretty trivial in the entire pipeline of meritocracy that you identified. So going on, look, the structural inequality that we see today can only result from and manifest in individuals is, for example, high test scores, CVs, and winning debate competitions. But these itself are reliant on material resources which are en masse and equally distributed. There was a fact that was raised to us in one of the keynote speakers that black graduates are less on average than white graduates when coming out of university. But if you segregate the people who, for example, are black graduates from Oxbridge, they actually make comparable amounts. The reason why black graduates earn on average less is because black schools are underfunded chronically. So this is a material problem that we need to address. The reason why race-based interventions have not succeeded because it disguises the true material deprivations and inequalities that actually occur. Side with opposition.
Well, thank you. A second very forceful speech. So going back to the proponents, this is Keanna Williams, is a lawyer at Clifford Channel. Oh, we're swapped. Millie.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I didn't have it down here. But how wonderful.
I guess in lieu of a bio, I will say that my outfit is from the 80s, unlike opposition's case, my debate points will not be. So, going on today, I'm going to do two key points. And what I'm really going to be looking at is the wider impact of economic inequality, which intersects with race, is not completely separate from race, which is the opposition's case. And then I'm going to look at other aspects of people's lives who are impacted on a race basis outside of professional and educational focus. So firstly, starting with the wider economic reality, what we hear from this side, wealth is crucially important in determining chances. And we absolutely agree over here. But let's look at the wealth gap, and let's look at it in terms of the racial wealth gap. For every £1 that white British families have in the bank, we have just 10 pence for black African and Bangladeshi families. So we see here a very clear link between the racial distribution of wealth in this country. Now what that means is it means that we have families with different housing situations, which has a crucial impact on your ability to not just receive a good education, but be in a mindset where you can make the most of that education in the first place. Especially with COVID, when our living rooms have become our offices, when they've become our classrooms, the material conditions we live in are crucially important. And we see that those conditions are far better for people with privilege for white people. And we see also the wider environment, the schools that we go to, the air that we breathe affects our physical well-being. And again, the schools with the lowest poorest air quality, both in London and around the UK, are schools with a higher number of students from diverse backgrounds. And this isn't just a coincidence that we see cropping up in every single element of our day-to-day lives. There is a very clear impact of race here. And what this does, it perpetuates disadvantage, and it means that individuals cannot make use of the opportunities, even if they were given opportunities in the first place, which we don't think that they were. Now let's look at other aspects of our life, because if race was not a determinant determining factor on how we get to our workspaces or how people are able to engage, then we wouldn't see inequitable outcomes in terms of actions from the police, from justice, and from security. And yes, microaggressions we actually do think are really important compared to this team which they don't. But we think there's also a systemic level at play here. Yes, you could be a young black boy being followed around the shop while you're trying to buy your lunch on the way to school. That creates an air of suspicion and agitation. That means you're not going to probably get the most from the same from your education that your white peer will. But we say it's also really important that young black boys are 18 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. And that they are, well, if I go down here, we've got just one of the 5,000 judges in the UK are from diverse backgrounds, which means when we get even further down the road to sentencing, we're not going to get equal distribution of justice there either. But you think actually that's not a problem, and that's probably not to do with race, that's something else.
Funny enough, since the 80s, wealth inequality is spiraling. Do you think that black people have less wealth because they are black, or that actually those who have less wealth, regardless of their race, might face this lack of upward social mobility that you described?
Yeah, again, that dichotomy doesn't really exist in history, right? When we look at how you're able to accumulate wealth, it's because of the opportunities that you were given. And yes, we may not have actively discriminatory laws that are allowed in this country. We've got legislation to protect against it. That wasn't true just 1 or 2 generations ago. It's that wealth, that inequality of wealth, is a byproduct of racial discrimination, overt racial discrimination that we're seeing in workplaces all across the UK. Going on to one more point, because what I really want to bring here is an intersectional focus. Because when we stand here and we say that actually we can rely on the progress that has been made, what we lose is progress for all people. And one of my favourite authors is a woman called Audre Lorde, and she really talks about the value of definitions and the importance of it, right? And if we stand up and we say just because there has been progress and that's enough, that's doing a massive disservice to those who are currently not served by the current equality agenda, right? So when we look at gender progress and we see that actually there hasn't been much progress at all for black women in the financial industry in the UK over the past 20 years, we say that is a very real problem, even if on average women are doing better, right? We need to look more specifically at the different lived experiences of different groups of people in order to serve them all. We beg you to propose.
That the note is right now, and that those opposing is John Ashworth, who's a second-year fast streamer working in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy on Steel and Metals Trade Policy. That's the date.
Thank you very much. The ultimate question that we ask from the old-fashioned opposition is quite simple. It is, if you were to make a policy aimed at uplifting vulnerable people, would you make it race-based, or would you make it materially-based? And let's be very clear. What the second speech gets wrong with its examples is the use of privilege as synonymous with race. It frankly isn't. We recognize in opposition all three of us have more privilege than the average person from our background. But what sets it apart is the money in the bank. I think the best example from this I saw on Netflix recently. In 2019, came to light the emission scandal in the United States, where colleges were literally letting people bribe their way in through backdoor channels, spending huge amounts of money. Their side of colorblind applications to all the developments that have been made within the US servers couldn't stop that. Because frankly, the amount of money that you have at the end of the day is the thing that propels people forward. Therefore, what are the solutions we need right now? Because Tex is correct. These are long-term problems. We argue they are universal solutions that are based on material conditions, not based upon race. The first argument I'm going to provide is where the nucleus of race-based action is systematically designed to limit social progress. A lot of words. Let's be very clear. Inequality is much more than the amalgamation of microaggressions. It is the disadvantage of physical conditions and material ones. On proposition, they rely on the race being the centrifuge for social justice, as in 2010, for the real weight of the societal problem that they discuss. We look upon broader factors, and we recognize that the class cleavages and strivings are different. And the reason why they are different is ultimately actually because they are the same. Because lots of people are fed with these kind of scenarios. So I've got two things under this. The first is about how people engage with this. And I think first, for those that are yet to succeed, people like myself, look, under their side, for the exact reason the first speaker gave you, race is like a prison. I can't change the color I am. I can go on holiday a little bit, make it a little bit darker, right? But I can't change that, right? And it means that people feel disempowered at the very moment you tell them that race is the cleavage that defines their existence and defines their life. What I can recognize as the first person to go to university in my family as well, from a disabled single-parent mother, I can change my financial condition. And secondly, within that, I, as someone who has succeeded, can then change that of other people. And not other people that necessarily just look like me at the end of the day, but other people that come from similarly disadvantaged backgrounds and have a level of empathy that I don't think people have at this very moment. And the best example of that is lots of the funding that comes from things like BAME organizations come directly from BAME people, because there is that empathy gap. Because people recognize because they don't look like the people they're trying to help that they can't. The second thing under this is political engagement. Because under their side, what you're able to get away with is very simple race-based action policies. Because politicians want to be seen to be effective, they want to be seen to do the right thing, but ultimately at not too much of a cost of their time and work. What does this look like? I mean, in American football, it looks like the Rooney Rule, getting people to interview based upon their color. It looks like affirmative action policies. But one, these are the policies that already benefit those with the connections, those with the privilege, those with these advantages. And sure, their side says, but it's a slow burner. The reason why it's a slow burner is because it takes such a long time for this trickle-down to work. Yes.
You're comparing class and race. Now, as someone who is northern, working class, single mother, I've come down to London. My accent, I promise, has got a bit lighter. I've read a few books on cheese, and I can work my way around circles, right? You've said yourself you cannot do the same with your skin colour. So how on earth are these things comparable?
This is really good, because this is the exact inverse of the stuff we're trying to claim. Because under their side, the fact that I'm a black person from Manchester and a black person from London actually makes less difference. When in reality, that's one of the big difference makers for lots of these people, because they go to the underfunded schools that my first speaker talked to about. And I'm going to get back to that in a second, but importantly what that means for their case is they propose less radical sounding policy of education reform, of big changes in the way in which we do policing structures, and instead replace Cressida Dick with someone who is from the minority background. And that is not sufficient in our world, and that doesn't make the change we'd like to see. But I suppose the second thing here, now I'm going to come back to this excellent stat in the very start, which is, look, the fundamentals that need to change are universal. Because what this point of where the amount of money that people earn when they graduate misses as well, is a couple of things. Not just where they graduate from, right? But on top of that, what they're able to do after they graduate, which is, I couldn't afford to go to the UN for free and go live in Geneva, because I didn't have the money, right? And I couldn't afford the material circumstances of going to do a master's. I couldn't afford the mishap of something going wrong, so I took myself a stable job. And ultimately, I'm someone who is going to multiply wealth throughout my career. And fixing that, and fixing those problems, is something that everyone is uniquely in a position to do, not those from
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely and concluding speakers, and the opposition will take the floor first. So Keanna Williams, who needs no introduction because he debates constantly.
I want to thank everyone for the contributions so far. This topic is complex, and that's been reflected both in the debate that we've had and the questions that have been asked. So I'm going to do my best job of weaving both the debate that we saw from the other side and the arguments we brought to the other side, proposition, the questions we heard from the floor, into three sort of broad areas. First question is, what does this meritocratic progression actually look like? Second is, if not race that impedes progress, what are the other factors that might be more significant? The third question is, what are the battles that we ought to be fighting as a group, and how should we go about doing those things? So ask this first question then, what does this meritocratic progression look like? Because we ask inside opposition, if we're going to have a debate about meritocratic progression, step one would be establishing, does modern Britain actually operate as a meritocracy in the first place? The key contention that TechWay begins this debate with is saying, success leads to talent. But even if we look no further than the chambers across the way, in the quality of our leadership under the Prime Minister, we begin to start asking questions about whether or not success is truly correlated with talent or competency. What we tried to say on the side opposition, it is hard to say that race is what is impeding our meritocratic progression if we're not even certain that the UK operates as a meritocracy in the very first instance. If it's not a meritocracy, what other factors might be leading to the leadership that we find ourselves stuck with? What we posit is that it's likely to be based on systems of oppression. These are systems that transcend race and are far more strongly correlated with who has access to wealth and privilege and who does not. That's why we're asked a very good question about if our leadership is decided by a roll of the dice. The question is, who has access to the dice? Who's invited to the table? And it's typically those with wealth and privilege, correlated with white people, and not those that lack privilege and lack opportunity. If it's decided based on secret handshakes and enormous amounts of privilege, side proposition has far more to demonstrate to you on their side as to why race is the relevant roadblock towards our progression, rather than this ladder that we're all imagining not really being a ladder. So the real question that I want you guys to move away from, and move towards actually in this debate, is whether or not meritocracy is actually operating for us at all. If meritocracy doesn't exist in the way that side proposition describes, blaming race doesn't seem like the right step for us to take. Let's now move secondly to this next question, and think about, if not race, what is it that is impeding our progression? Let's have a little think. Let's cast our minds back. No, thank you for now. We've had allies, we've had resource groups, we've had affirmative action, and it predates the suit. Okay? We've had this before George Floyd. We've had it for generations. The question we then have to ask is, if race is the significant barrier that they describe, why hasn't race-based policies led to significant increases in the representations of black people? The reason why it hasn't led is because there are far more fundamental measures and undercurrents that are working against our social progression that aren't necessarily related to race. I have the benefit of having Josh here, who's much better at statistics than I am. And he explained to me earlier on, there's a difference between correlation and causation. And we think that side proposition has fallen right into that trap. They've identified a confounding variable, that of race. And they've said it is race, and that is the basis on which we find ourselves unable to achieve. Unfortunately, them demonstrating that race is correlated with poverty is not a debate. That is a state of affairs. They think that their work is done. Unfortunately for side proposition, it's not. They have to go far further in this debate to actually demonstrate to us why all the other factors like education, social capital, political capital, the cities that you live in, aren't the basis on which we lack our access to certain institutions. Fundamentally, they've misidentified race as the boogeyman that they would like to fight. This now moves us on, thirdly, to the real question in this debate of what are the battles that we ought to be fighting and how. We think that this kind of position that side proposition takes encourages us to identify the lowest hanging fruits. What do those look like? They typically are ways for us to identify race-based policies, but miss the real fights. And the audience has quite rightly pointed out that people see colour first. But we've got to ask the question of, who aren't we seeing? Who isn't in the room? Fundamentally, the people that don't get access to the keys are those that were never invited to the table in the very first instance. They're the ones that, because of a lack of access to quality education, because of a lack of access to truly radical wealth redistribution, we live in a country where 7% of students attended private institutions, and yet they make up 32% of our MPs. That has nothing to do with race. That has to do with the allocation of education opportunities, regardless of where we live. I know I'm touching on the end of time. There's one last message I'd like to leave you guys with. If you want your organizations to be more diverse, I think it is truly underwhelming, dishonest, and irresponsible for you to choose only to hire people like me. What you ought to be advocating for is far more radical redistributions of wealth, redistributions of opportunity, to ensure that I am not the exception, but in fact the rule. Identifying race as the culprit misses that opportunity. Let's not continue to miss it.
And finally, Keanna Williams.
deep down that there is only one truth in this debate. And it's a truth that we in this room probably all know so well and so personally. So instead of actually doing their job as debaters and dealing with the debate, what they have done is lie to us and present a new myth that will therefore add to the furtherance of the D&I merry-go-round to debate, to suggest that meritocracy doesn't exist, and then to subtly and deceitfully create a whole new argument for side opposition, to suggest that we all of a sudden are discounting policies and doing all of these things, when in actuality none of the individuals in side opposition have ever said such. Because the audacious decision to birth a new myth actually sets us further back and in turn supports the core of this debate. That as you have so eloquently continued to go on to do and do, you've raised, wealth being the paramount factor, right? But at the core of every single example you've all individually raised, you acknowledge that race remains there. So in your bid to discuss correlation and causation and statistics and try and spin the audience with all of these wonderful different examples that don't really connect or match up, if we drew a simple Venn diagram, regardless of how skilled you are in causation and correlation, you would see that in the middle, therein lies once again race. And so I'm not here to share just a personal story or anecdote, but I think it's really important to actually define what meritocracy is, and the floor so wonderfully acknowledged the truth, that meritocracy does exist. And I won't go into unpack how it exists for white people, because I personally, as rightfully said, I'm not entirely sure when I do see some of the individuals who are at the highest positions. However, at its core, it is defined as being selected according to merit. That an individual's success is inherently connected to their talent and ability. And the reality and the truth is that does exist. That exists for those who are white, that exists for those who are white and wealthy, and for some individuals, although side opposition failed to actually acknowledge this truth, and Millie so wonderfully stated that you can potentially be white and less privileged in terms of your wealth, but learn to assimilate and once again be able to be viewed as someone for their talent and their success. No, thank you. So, the story that I'd like to share in the time that I have is one that I think we can all relate to. So when I was a little girl, I was told that I have to work hard, but not only work hard, but 10 times as hard as my white peers. My mom was told the same thing, my grandmother was told the same thing, my father, my grandfather, my friends, my brothers, and I have to consider, will I unfortunately also bear the brunt of telling my children the same thing? Because the reality is that hard work and talent is required to be successful. But when you impound that with race, there is an additional level of hard work and talent that one has, and it's simply audacious and insulting for side opposition to suggest that all of us in this room haven't worked hard, or to suggest that hard work has never been a thing for us, and merely because we don't have enough money or grandeur, that's why we're not successful. When in actuality, there are many individuals with the wealth and the privilege that side opposition so wonderfully lay out, but yet still reach that glass ceiling, as the wonderful lady on the floor spoke about, where they also haven't been successful. So, to the audience, I don't have a lot of time, otherwise I would indeed spend all this time telling you exactly point by point why side opposition have in fact lost this debate and knew that they had lost it from the very beginning, hence why they gave us this very flawed and insane statement. But I raised these a few things. So on our side, we've been honest. We say that, meritocracy does exist. It's an unfortunate reality that only exists for some and not for all. And we say that in order to actually progress and to succeed, we have to have honest and uncomfortable conversation. We have to recognize in the intersectionality debate that particularly within the context of race, that people do have different access to privilege. But in the discourse of pretending that's not the case, what we do is pretend that if you are wealthy and black, you will automatically succeed, when that's not true. And we see that because we continue to have this discourse of bringing the two things together, or pretending that the only argument is whether you are wealthy or black or wealthy and brown, what we do is actually hold us back. Because an individual who is wealthy and has come from a black background, is black, or perhaps has come from a more privileged background, or perhaps was born in a black majority, so their understanding of race fundamentally may be different until they come to this land, those individuals deserve to have a place at the debate, and the policy inequalities and the progress that we need to make needs to reflect that. In the same way that an individual whose race is a key factor but has also existed in a less privileged background, that discussion also needs to be had too. And so on side proposition, I wrap up and I say this. We have been honest with you. We have told you the truth. We have told you that all people deserve to live and exist and work in a world where you are truly judged purely by your talent, by your merit, and by your ability. On side proposition, we are saying that we want a world where the playing field is indeed level, where our white peers and our black peers and our brown peers and everyone, I promise you I'm coming, has the same experience and in between. And that's what we argue today on side proposition. That we believe that people deserve to be respected, they're all wonderfully and fearfully made, and that meritocracy exists and indeed it should exist for all. Thank you.